Hello and welcome to Hunter Gatherers, the podcast of Hunter S. Thompson stories. We are coming to you live from GonzoFest in Louisville, Kentucky, and regular listeners will know that we've promised. This is our 50th show, and when we began, a good friend and mentor said that I should not judge myself until the 50th episode, and then I'd be okay. So this is episode 49 of our multiple-part series, so listen closely. Somewhere in here, I get good, and I can't wait because it's been, as you know, tedious. We're here reversing roles a bit. I'm going to welcome Christopher Tidmore, my co-host and producer, because he is going to introduce the first guest from GonzoFest.
And I can honestly say Curtis Robinson and I traveled all the way to Louisville for me, a New Orleanian, to have somebody from New Orleans.
Yeah.
In fact, not just any somebody.
Well, you've got to admit, I've done pretty well. I've only mentioned it 7 times.
T.R. Johnson is quite literally the guru on the New Orleans literary history.
Thank you.
That is the name of his most recent book. There's also New Orleans Writer City and other comments. So it's a man who understands literary history, is here speaking about one of his idols who he knew. And, of course, Curtis knew very well, and that's Hunter S. Thompson, hence why we're at the 10th, and so they tell me, final GonzoFest. We'll actually find that out in the next couple of parts of this episode. But, TR, you came up on stage, and you talked about, in the first panel here at GonzoFest here in Louisville, about Hunter S. Thompson as more than just a writer, as more than just even a literary figure, as a character of literary history in America that helped create our American mythos. Can you talk about that?
I'd be happy to, it's, I've not participated in GonzoFest before, so I'm so happy to be, squeezing into the last one, and so grateful to be a part of this, and to have a chance to kind of work out a few thoughts about him. And the point I made during that panel that maybe I can enlarge upon a little bit is that as fabulous, brilliant a writer as Hunter so often was, and piercing into just true poetic vision, it seems to me, on many, many occasions, and why we love him so much. There's a broader achievement here that I think we're only beginning to kind of comprehend, and at least me, I'm only now beginning to comprehend it, is that Hunter turned himself into a character in American literature, and it was something that it takes great courage and great risk to live the way he did as a kind of master of the art of provocation, forcing people to react to him and then playing with their reaction or not in one way or another, and basically leaving an indelible imprint on everybody he got anywhere near, just over and over and over again, decade after decade after decade. It's an incredibly brave thing to do. It's an incredibly risky thing to do. You can imagine it could have gone sideways badly any number of times. One can imagine what, there's guns, there's drugs, there's trouble. And he lived that very high-risk way, and in so doing, became a kind of permanent part of he's a character in the American imagination now that will be with us forever. I think he's ultimately going to, as iconic and legendary as like Rip Van Winkle or Edgar Allan Poe or Harry Houdini. He's a permanent part of the cultural landscape of the United States, and a permanent part of, he's one of the fixtures through which we imagine who we are. That's on top of what he achieved as a writer. He's just inhabited the world and lived his life in a way that is out of all proportion to any single living human being could imagine being. It was a kind of theater that he was a master of and carried out for 40 plus years.
We told you we're coming to you live from GonzoFest, and that glass breaking is not a sound effect.
Exactly. That was the ghost of Hunter.
That was Oompa coming in, so it's definitely. But that actually is kind of an interesting thing. So many people at GonzoFest are comparing Hunter as one of the legends. I mean, Curtis, you and I were talking yesterday about the fact that in 100 years, people will know who Hunter S. Thompson is in a way that other authors are forgotten. I'm curious. I always compared Hunter being, the literary geek that I am, to like someone along the lines of Ambrose Bierce, who was huge in his time. But more and more, based on what I'm hearing, and I say this with great love, is a love of Hunter's writings, is he our modern Mark Twain?
Wow. That's a great question, and I think that he may be. I think that let me speak to it in a couple of ways. I think of Hunter increasingly, very much like the Mark Twain who gave us Huck Finn, as a product of a certain kind of river town. That is to say, river towns like Louisville, like New Orleans, are places where there's sort of historically kind of a transient population, young men floating in and out, and young men who are untethered are going to be inclined to drink and gamble and carry on and so on and so on. Hunter is a product of a river town in every way, from the the kind of devil-may-care semi-criminality that hovers around him all the time, the partying, the footloose, adrift kind of vibe feels like Huckleberry Finn transposed into the latter half of the 20th century to me. In that sense, there's the Twain connection. Also, the sardonic wit that is a trademark of Twain is Hunter's stock in trade in a deep way. And there's a famous Mark Twain line. He says, I never let my schooling get in the way of my education. And Hunter is that person completely. A very uneasy relationship to, say, academics who are in charge of sort of preserving the past and cultivating a canon in one way or another, or debating it and so on. And Hunter, I feel, I teach American Lit courses from time to time. In fact, a lot of times.
We can say at Tulane University.
At Tulane University.
Yeah.
And I have not yet quite managed to put Hunter on my syllabus for American Lit. I've wanted to, but in a rush of getting that class together, I haven't quite figured out how to find the right piece to put in, precisely because he is a vexing, sort of troubling figure to a lot of contemporary cultural concerns. He's a gun nut. And we're living in a time where we got a gun problem. We're living in a time where there's a horrific opioid crisis, and he's a drug enthusiast. There's also a pretty rough and tumble language around race. At least it doesn't square with the kind of the kinds of ways English departments want to speak about these things. And so it's difficult to do Hunter in an English department, and preserve and advance the reputation that way. But he's so powerful and so extraordinary through events like this that in some ways he doesn't really need university seals of approval to be kind of kept in circulation, because he did it himself. He kind of made his own way. Didn't really go to college, and made his own path, independent of institutions, in a way that in some ways fulfills kind of some of the highest American fantasies of freedom, of being outside institutions, outside the kind of correct and proper, well-mannered ways of comporting ourselves around great literature, capital G, capital L. He was a true wild man and an American original in ways that we can't help but sort of treasure and love, even as vexing as it is vis-a-vis kind of modern manners in intellectual life.
Well, it's interesting from the stage. You referred to him, I think, at one point as a performance artist.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting because there's always this discussion. Did the persona take him over?
Right.
And I'm like, persona is one that is one way of looking at it, at the persona. But I always thought it was the character itself. It was interesting. I was with Hunter on the phone when he was. When I would hang out there, and I remember a conversation with Marilyn Manson. Marilyn Manson did not consider himself a rock and roll artist. He considered himself a performance artist. And I can remember a conversation.
Quite literally a vaudevillian. That's
Yes.
how he described himself.
Yes. And so after that, that was always the thing of like, are they coming to talk to me? Or are they coming to talk to that? I said, well, when you published Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas as Raoul Duke, initially, you kind of invite that kind of thing, don't you? And I think he was interested in that, but it's interesting, persona versus persona is such a negative kind of term, and performance artist just isn't.
Right. And I think it's so interesting. I would assume that Hunter would have been very intrigued by Marilyn Manson, because I think that there's a way in which, as Marilyn Manson, as a very kind of shocking performance artist, is in some ways dipping into the same channels that Hunter, in a different kinds of ways, was inhabiting. A shocker, a kind of a person who unsettles things simply by his presence. And it's fascinating, thinking back to Mark Twain for a minute.
We mean Marilyn Manson, the singer.
Yeah. Marilyn Manson, right. And
not other forms of Manson. No,
right. Exactly. I hope we make that clear for sure. But thinking about the connection to Twain again, I know that Twain was frequently sort of on the road giving like talks and lectures before public audiences, and Hunter, that was a income stream off and on through the years.
For the same reason, they were broke.
Exactly.
Twain lost all the money trying to create a printing
Well, let's display it. He created a publishing company and then gave Ulysses S. Grant the greatest deal in the history of time. So much deal that he lost everything he owned.
Right.
Yeah, so
and would never be heard from again.
Yeah, except
but I thought about him a lot when when Leonard Cohen lost all of his money and had to go on the road. I'm like, he's doing a Mark Twain here.
That's right.
So it's pretty good. It's,
yeah.
But it's interesting also that when you talk about the difficulties, the cultural difficulties of adding Hunter Thompson to your class.
Mm-hmm.
Could you read Huck Finn aloud today by yourself in front of your class?
Yeah, there is the very singular and particular concern. I think that
A little rusty on their Twain. We mean the particular character. Name. Well, I'll just say N-word for those of you who are the N-word Jim.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. And I find that my personal take on that is that obviously we have to be endlessly careful with our language and the ways that particular word is indissolubly linked with bloody violence and terrorism, and that we need to honor the truth that's how it will land in the ears of many of our students. And that said, that word shows up in Faulkner, and I teach Absalom quite a bit.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that word is in there a bunch, but it's always coming from the mouth of a particular character as opposed to the author himself. And that's how with Absalom,
or the name of a character.
Right,
a major character in the book.
And so typically I think when people teach Huck Finn, they say Slave Jim.
They would actually change that, you think?
Well, yeah,
that's what we're doing now?
I think so. But it's tricky and uncomfortable. But I think that I have not found a way to finesse the ways Hunter is. I just need more time. I'm sure I can find a piece.
As someone, I used to try to help edit Hunter's work, and it's deceptive because you can change one word, and I mean a tiny word, and the entire paragraph and page and chapter just falls apart.
Sure.
It's so interesting, the dynamic. The example I always give is any of us might think up to describe someone as having the loyalty one would expect from a snake, but Hunter said he has the loyalty of a rented snake. And it's just a world of difference, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah.
It's a world of difference.
Yeah.
I do want to ask one quick question, because I always think I think of the Mark Twain as the answer, mainly because Mark Twain was a newspaper reporter.
Yes.
And so both Curtis and I are refugees from journalism. I still commit acts of journalism from time to time.
Right.
He manages to avoid it until it's really big, and then he does it as well.
Right.
That aspect came to it, but it was also the serialization of story.
Right.
And the other comparison I always make of Hunter is Charles Dickens. Now, people will say Charles Dickens, he's a fiction writer. Hunter's not writing fiction. Both of them are creating characters that are speaking from their own experience.
Right.
David Copperfield is Charles Dickens. I mean, so many different ways. Raoul Duke is that. And they're both performing on stage, and they're both creating characters that of themselves, almost caricatures, to sell them. And they're both touring the West, and they're both going to... I think that's why I was so intrigued by the way you put it, T.R. Johnson, about the concept of Hunter creating this caricature of himself to say it, because some of the greatest authors really did that. They were performers and frustrated actors. Dickens was a frustrated actor. Twain, for the most part, was. Hunter Thompson definitely was.
Yeah.
So
it's a great point. And I think, thinking of Dickens, too, in these terms, it's the doing portraits of society, trying to sort of capture the truth of a society. That was absolutely kind of Hunter's sort of self-assignment in the Vegas book and throughout his journalism, it seems to me. And that, building, characters, particularly of themselves, as a way of getting at some deep truth about society. One of my favorite Hunter lines is, "I'm a roadman for the lords of karma," which came kind of late, one of the last of his real gems, it seems to me. But he's out there, like a roadman, a roadie, running around the West and college campuses, stirring up trouble and sort of trusting the fates will all allow things to play out in a way that rewards the good and punishes the evil, and that he was doing the very dangerous, high-risk work of throwing himself kind of over the waterfall into the realm of consequence, or as he calls it, the place of definitions.
Yes,
where the rubber hits the road.
And speaking of the visits, particularly like to college campuses, could Hunter I mean, you appeared on campuses dozens of times to students. Could you book Hunter Thompson onto that campus tour today?
Probably, because his reputation as an artist and as a reporter are substantial enough, and his literary achievement is widely embraced enough that he is not someone who is speaking on behalf of values that are antithetical to a liberal arts college, a liberal arts education, let's say. He is not advocating race hatred. He is not advocating gun violence, things like that. And therefore, I think that there would be room for him. Now, some campuses, it's such, booking speakers is a real hot button issue and a flashpoint for all kinds of protests and dissent. But I think that Hunter's charm and large-heartedness ultimately, and his wide open sort of Americanness, a kind of Whitman-like embrace of multitudes and easygoing readiness to engage anybody would make him, I think, welcome, even if certain questions of, again, I'm thinking of guns and I'm thinking of drugs. People are kind of, in the post-Columbine era and in the opioid era, people are less enthusiastic about that stuff than they were a generation ago. But I don't think he's in a place where he is on the wrong side of an argument at all. I can't see Hunter being vilified for his politics by anyone in higher education. He's an advocate of, I guess you could say, a libertarian and a kind of Darwinian in a sense, he might say, a roadman for the Lords of Karma. But I don't see him as being someone who is in any way an enemy of the values of a liberal arts education.
Going back to your point about the River City aspect, of course, I'm thinking Twain and the idea he grew up, in Missouri. He's right on the river. Louisville is kind of a very similar type of experience, but it also has something. And I have to, since you literally wrote the book of a literary history of New Orleans. Hunter loved New Orleans. In fact, Curtis was with him just a couple weeks before he died in New Orleans. The question that I get is, New Orleans and Louisville have something in common that even though I'd been here before, I never really thought about it until the last few days. They're both southern cities that aren't quite southern.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're both on the edges.
Right.
They're both influenced with a core French history, but they both had a lot of people coming through. And in some ways, that kind of port yet connection kind of explains Hunter Thompson in some ways.
I think so. I've come to that just, it took years of living in New Orleans before I could quite understand that aspect of Hunter. But I think it makes great sense that Louisville and New Orleans, I tell people, I grew up, in fact, not far from where we're sitting right now. I remember this building vividly from my childhood and youth. And I lived here till I was actually in my early 30s. So I have a lot of Louisville in me. But what it shares with New Orleans, obviously Rivertown, a lot of immigrants, a lot of Catholics. And like river towns, they are kind of friendly to vice. And so Louisville, obviously, the whiskey and cigarettes and gambling on horses. This growing up here was a perfect sort of preparation for a very happy life in New Orleans that I've come to have. It was I just moved to the big leagues. It was the natural next step.
Yes.
And I'm not at all surprised to hear that Hunter reacted so positively to New Orleans. Some friends of mine bumped into him just shortly before he died at the Circle Bar in what is now called Harmony Circle, in those days Lee Circle. And he was gracious and fun and a very cool guy, and we lost him just very soon thereafter. I had heard a rumor that Hunter had been talking a lot about wanting to move to New Orleans and live in New Orleans, that it was something he regretted that he had never lived there for an extended period because he felt like there was great subject matter for him there. As a Louisville guy, he was going to take to it like a duck to water, so to speak. And he certainly had things to say about Miami and things to say about Las Vegas. But I think that New Orleans was probably a missed opportunity for him. And in fact, from what I understand, it was something he explicitly had said that he regretted not having made time to kind of swoop in there and do several years, getting in there. Because it's a writer's city, as the title of New Orleans, a writer's city, is the title of my new book. He would have,
which is available at the Garden District Bookshop for anybody who wants, at gardendistrictbookshop.com.
Oh, nice. You can segue or you can jump in. I say you just go for it.
Yeah, but I think he would have been, he would have found a lot to do there and a lot to think about and a lot to talk about. it might have been a kind of challenging environment in certain ways. I remember one year he tried to go to Jazz Fest and was grumpy that they wouldn't let him come in with his .357 Magnum, and they said, well, if I can't come in with without my gun, I'm not coming in. And that, he may have. I dare say that he would have met his match in New Orleans, Louisiana. Certainly, it would have been a subject that he would have found a lot to do with. Pirate culture and the sort of sportsman's life in the swamps and the gun culture of Louisiana, he would have taken to immediately. The gambling culture around the sport, the casino culture, it's Vegas on the bayou. And then just as a Louisville guy, I think he would have been very interested in this idea of an urban center in the South that is not purely and simply Southern, but kind of bookend Louisville and New Orleans, as you say, kind of bookends of the South, kind of the edges of the South that are not purely and simply Southern in the way that, let's say, Jackson, Mississippi is, or Birmingham, Alabama, maybe an example, and so on. It's a cosmopolitan and complicated place in a way, Catholic places in some ways that most of the South isn't thought of. So he would have found a lot to connect with and respond to and sort out.
Well, I have to say, in defense of Birmingham, Alabama, he did also love Birmingham.
Did he really?
He loved Birmingham. He wrote a piece about a way to die going naked off of Red Mountain in Birmingham. If you can look it up, it's a great piece. But the reason is, I once lived in Birmingham. I always complained that when I went from Birmingham, Alabama, and moved to Los Angeles, one of the problems was that Birmingham was a 24-hour city,
right?
And Los Angeles is not.
Okay.
So it was. So I used to lament poor Birmingham, but I take your point that Birmingham is certainly a southern city.
Sure.
It is not. It's not on the bubble at all. But
right.
He did love that, and I think the car that he mentioned was actually his Jaguar. But I digress. That's the problem with Hunter Thompson stories, is there are
there's
so
always another one.
many. Yes,
yeah,
there are.
It's like eating potato chips.
Well, I do have to ask, because we are at the 10th, and I'm told by Ron Whitehead, final GonzoFest.
Right.
But
I think Mr. Whitehead don't protest too much, but that's just me. You guys go ahead.
We're having debates over that, and we've had a couple of people come to us and say, if Ron won't do it in Louisville, what are you doing? So, I am curious, because you brought the first panel at GonzoFest was about the '96 gathering.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at Curtis. You have a hat that you're wearing right now, if I'm not mistaken. You're the one person who wasn't at this '96 gathering, but you have a hat.
I was not. Hunter S. Thompson went to a landmark milestone reunion, and all I got was this Kentucky cap. But I do still have the Kentucky cap. This was literally a gift he brought back because I couldn't come.
Oh man, that's fabulous.
Well, and I'm curious about that event, because I knew about it. I knew he came home. I knew the tribute. I'd heard a lot of Johnny Depp stories about that gathering.
Yeah.
I knew we've done a couple of episodes. What I didn't understand, really, I had a vague notion, but I didn't really understand, was how influenced it was to other authors, other events, and to the city so much. Because let's just get, and Ron is going to join us in the next episode and talk about this. Louisville didn't really embrace Hunter.
No.
And I would argue still hasn't.
It really hasn't.
Right.
And that was the first moment.
Right.
We'll talk about the emolence where they basically, the mayor comes out and renames it Hunter's Gonzoville and all this. But more importantly, it's kind of a seminal transitional moment in 1996.
Right.
I saw it from the other end, because I was working for Steve Ambrose at the time, and Doug was going off to this thing.
Sure.
And we were kind of busy trying to put together this museum at this time. So it was this, a lot of people who weren't really aware of Hunter became aware because of this thing. Can you talk about it?
I'd be happy to. One of Hunter's great lines, there's, as I was saying, there's at least 24 of these kinds of things. One of Hunter's greatest lines is the truth is never told between 9 and 5. And the people who are, how shall we say, the official power brokers and sort of shapers of civic identity are 9 to 5 people. And with all due respect to the power and money that they command, Hunter represents a different universe and speaks to and from a different universe. As we say in New Orleans, Hunter is night people, the night manager, and so the question of a city embracing some figure that is a native son is a 9 to 5 kind of operation. And Hunter is is just the kind of person who is just, it's going to be very hard for them to assimilate and swallow what he was. It took until 1996, and it went off beautifully, that event. And it's particularly moving to me. I really loved Juan Thompson's memoir about growing up as Hunter's son. I was really hoping he would be here today to meet him, and maybe I'll meet him later in the weekend. But I really admired what he did in that book. It's a beautiful piece of writing, a beautiful piece of storytelling, and very profoundly, he seems to say that it was at that event that he and his father reconciled after having been, if I understand correctly, almost entirely estranged for about 15 years, maybe more. His mother, Juan's mother, Sandy, split with their son around, I want to say about 79 or 80, and that he stayed away from his dad for a long time, and that was a scene of reconciliation. So it was not simply Hunter's returning to reconcile with Louisville and being embraced by Louisville, but it was a father-son story of incredible profundity. Father and son had been, if I understand correctly, not in touch for more than a decade, and that happened on that stage in a way that's incredibly moving.
Yeah, well, not in touch, but then the piece that Juan read at that, I thought was just fantastic, and I think that moved him closer in a lot of ways, and in terms of words. But that's nothing better than. I just thought it was a remarkable piece, and I think you're accurate in that assessment. That I think the question of that is, how estranged they might have been. I think there was contact and things, but certainly after that, it was a different world. But I mean, it was partly a different world because Juan read. I thought it was one of the most touching things I'd ever read.
Yeah, I agree. It was so moving. Yeah, incredible.
T.R. Johnson, thank you so much for joining us on Hunter Gatherers. It's been I look forward to interviewing you more about literary figures in New Orleans and
guys,
your academic
let's get
work.
Together in the Big Easy.
We will.
We gotta do that.
We had to come all the way to Louisville to have a New Orleans conversation. So, but thank you so much. Your books are obviously available at my bookstore, but also online and all this. New Orleans Literary History, New Orleans Writer City, and frankly, I think you gave one of the most beautiful tributes to Hunter Thompson as a signature figure.
You really
of American
you
jazz.
had a great response, and you deserved it.
Thank you. So really appreciate that very much. We got to hang out in New Orleans, guys.
Sounds like a plan.
Let's do it soon.
And we'll be back still at GonzoFest with Ron Whitehead in our next episode.